And now to our first plenary session. At every conference since the beginning, it's been a conscious part of the plan to invite at least one of our plenary speakers from a little bit outside the conversation about pedagogy, teaching, learning, education, and so on. It's one of my beliefs that if a Christian scholarly conversation about teaching and learning is going to mature over time, it's going to need to draw ideas, concepts, discourses from outside of social science-based education theory. It's one reason why our conference is quite interdisciplinary. We encourage presentations from across the disciplines. But it's also driven us to try to find plenary speakers who are maybe kind of a hop and a step to the left or the right of this conversation, who we think might have something to say that might help us think, but are from just a little outside of our own conversation. The goal is for us to listen, to learn, and to try to find some fresh directions to think in that we might not have thought of from within our bubble. And the work of Christine Pohl seemed to me like an ideal candidate for this role at this conference. Professor Pohl is Associate Provost and Professor of Christian Ethics at Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky, where she's taught for 28 years. She's also been involved in congregational and parachurch ministry and in work with refugees. My confidence that her work might offer a fruitful conversation partner for us didn't require a whole lot of speculation, since it's already been regularly cited in discussions at this conference. In the past few years, Jake Stratman, a regular here, known to some of you, David Anderson, Rebecca Burwell, Mackenzie Heiser, and Aminta Arrington have all published work in the International Journal of Christianity and Education on hospitality in relation to teaching and learning, and all of those articles prominently cite the work of Christine Pohl, including especially her essential volume, Making Room, Recovering Hospitality as a Christian Tradition, but also various related articles. Professor Pohl's name also appears in footnotes to the book Teaching and Christian Practices, which emerged from a Kai's Institute project and was the theme of one of our past conferences a few years ago. Her more recent volume, Living into Community, Cultivating Practices that Sustain Us, continues her emphasis on recovering vital Christian practices and offers further potential connections to the life of the educational setting, I think. Her other titles include Friendship at the Margins, Discovering Mutuality in Service and Mission, Living on the Boundaries, Evangelical Women, Feminism and the Theological Academy, and Refugees, Christian Reflections on a Global Crisis. I'm delighted that she could be with us for this conference and that she can begin proceedings this evening, and welcome her warmly to the conference and the conversation. Please welcome her with me.
Good evening. I am delighted to be part of this conference and really honored to have been invited to address you. I'll be speaking on hospitality and teaching and the various intersections of practices. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'll be speaking on hospitality and teaching and the intersections of various practices. But I thought I would introduce my presentation tonight by sharing a little bit of my own story, since my life has been so deeply intertwined with both the practices of hospitality and teaching for the past 30 years or so. I will be retiring from full-time teaching at Asbury Seminary this coming June, and the process of anticipating retirement has proven to be exceedingly revelatory. It's both a significant and challenging time to reflect on experiences, to gather together and sort files and books and class notes and committee meeting notes and so on, and there are infinite quantities of those. But to also gather what I've learned over 30 years and what it all means. Until recently, I hadn't really thought about the fact that I started my major research on hospitality and writing for my PhD dissertation at Emory. The same year I started full-time teaching at Asbury. And so for 30 years, more or less, teaching and hospitality have both been central to my life. But actually, in the case of hospitality, I had been practicing it for about 15 years before. I started doing research on it And in terms of teaching, I had been doing it more informally for about 15 years before starting at Asbury. And so when I think about it, just about all of my adult life has been spent in and on these topics. And yet, while I've intuitively applied hospitality concerns to teaching, I haven't formally reflected on the intersection of hospitality and teaching nearly as much as I have on hospitality and justice concerns, hospitality and social work, hospitality and gender or refugees or immigration, or homelessness or disability, or more generally, hospitality in the Christian tradition. So in some ways, my comments tonight shouldn't be preliminary, given how much time I've had to reflect on the intersections of hospitality and teaching, but I feel as if I'm something of a novice at speaking about this particular intersection. So as I said, I teach Christian ethics at Asbury. At the master's level, most of my students are preparing for ministry, either lay or ordained. And I teach the required class in ethics every semester. I also teach classes in the ethics of hospitality and the ethics of community, and some on gender concerns. So just a couple observations at the start. Christian formation has been central to my life and work. And other than Christian education or Christian discipleship, I'm not sure there is a field or discipline whose content is more oriented to formation than Christian ethics. Nor is there a setting more oriented to formation than a seminary. But if you add to that the fact that I teach on topics of Christian formation in terms of hospitality and community, my experience of teaching and learning is probably a little bit unusual or even odd, but I hope my insights will be helpful and applicable to your settings. So the outline for my presentation is this. I want to give a quick overview of the hospitality tradition. It will be brief because I think many of you are already familiar with its basic elements, but then I'd like to reflect on hospitality and some of the developments and changes that I've noticed in the last 30 years, in the time that basically I've worked on the topic. And then suggest what I've learned about teaching and hospitality in the intervening decades, sort of looking at a practice within a practice. And with that, I'll reflect on several other practices and their intersections with hospitality. So an overview. When I began my research on hospitality, there was not much academic or even practical reflection on the practice of hospitality, with a few exceptions. Henry Nouwen had done a little bit of work, Parker Palmer had written. There's a long tradition of hospitality in the Catholic worker movement that actually harkens back to Irish monasticism, and some minimal scholarly research, especially in New Testament hospitality. But mostly, it was commonly understood as entertaining, or in Henry Nouwen's words, hospitality conjured up images of tea parties, bland conversation, and a general atmosphere of coziness. But my experiences in working with refugees and homeless people and students and seekers and people with disabilities had persuaded me that there was far more to hospitality than entertaining. While I initially had no idea that hospitality was part of some grand tradition, I knew it mattered more than tea parties and coziness. Today, there's much more attention to hospitality for a variety of reasons, and application of its elements to various areas, whether it's education or particularly to church planting and church growth, discipleship, along with its presence in discussions about immigration and responding to difference. And as I surveyed the materials on hospitality and education, I noticed again, as David was mentioning, how much some of you had done on it, and the wonderfully insightful discussions within the Kuyers Institute over the years. And so I'm very grateful for the work that the Institute and David have been doing, and so many other people. But the practice of hospitality is at the heart of the gospel, and it is basic to what it means to be Jesus' disciples. When we read the scriptures attentive to themes and expressions of hospitality, we quickly discover that they are everywhere. Many of the texts will be familiar to you, but just to start, think of the story of Abraham and Sarah and the three strangers they welcome. that's in Genesis 18. It's a story that's overflowing with blessing and promise. Abraham and Sarah offer their unexpected guests traditional hospitality, just exactly what was expected in the culture. They give welcome, they give honor, deference, they prepare special food, and they give the people a place to rest. And at some point during the encounter, Abraham and Sarah realize they're hosting angels. And as they offer their hospitality, they receive the promise that they will have a son in their old age. It is the most important Old Testament story for the hospitality tradition. But if we move from Genesis to Revelation, think of John's picture of Jesus in Revelation 3, standing at the door and knocking, and promising to those who open it that he will come in and join them for a meal. From Genesis to Revelation, there are stories of hospitality. Sometimes they're really beautiful, sometimes they're very disturbing, but the theme appears regularly throughout the biblical narrative. From the description of the Israelites as strangers and sojourners, commanded by God to welcome other strangers and sojourners and to care for them, to the images in the Gospels of Jesus as guest and stranger and host, practices and themes of hospitality are present. Jesus, who himself had no home on earth, is often described as welcoming or hosting crowds, feeding them, and making a place for them on hillsides or on lake shores or sometimes in other people's houses. But the image of God as host actually, I think, goes back to the creation narrative itself in the Garden of Eden, where God creates a magnificent place for humankind. And the God as host, is surely present within the Exodus accounts. In the wilderness, God directly and miraculously supplies manna every day to the people of Israel. And much later, in the Gospel of John, we read that Jesus says he is himself the bread of life, the manna, the bread that has come down from heaven. So that Jesus, even more than guest and host, Jesus is also our food, our sustenance. And this, I believe, invites us to appreciate the extraordinary enactment of hospitality in the Eucharist, where followers of Christ are welcomed to his table and fed by his sacrifice. So that hospitality condenses much of the meaning of the gospel. The earliest Christians understood the importance of hospitality to the Christian life. They recognized that it was practically necessary, and the divine character of hospitality as well, even when they struggled with it. They welcomed one another into their homes when people were fleeing persecution or when they were traveling to share the gospel. They ate together regularly so that the poor in their communities would be fed, but also so that they could keep their newfound Christian identity alive in a hostile environment. And in the context of personal gatherings, of shared meals, and generous welcome and worship, they nurtured new believers into faith and a new way of living. Really, hospitality was the context for the spread or transmission of the gospel and for the formation of new believers. And the message that they spread was the offer of God's welcome. It wasn't easy, and within the biblical text itself, we discover the earliest leaders reminding one another and their people of the importance of hospitality, and that in welcoming strangers, some had entertained angels without knowing it, the Hebrews 13 passage. They also challenged one another not to become, quote, grudging in the practice in 1 Peter 4, which is an indication that hospitality had its costs, and people could become weary or discouraged or find themselves taken advantage of. Hospitality was also the framework within which the early church worked through their struggles over ethnic and status differences. It was very difficult for early followers of Jesus to work out how rich and poor believers could be equals in the community of faith, and how Jews and Gentiles could be one in Christ. It was difficult for people who had despised one another, who had seen the other as dirty or less than human, to change their entire viewpoint and relate to them as brothers and sisters. And the church really struggled to shape a new way of life and discipleship in which these differences were transcended. And much of that transformation happened in the context of hospitality and shared meals. They learned together to respect and value one another as God valued them. There were numerous failures, and the Bible is quite honest about the difficulties. We see their struggles in the book of Acts, in Paul's letters to the Corinthians and to the Galatians, and in the book of James. The church struggled with questions about who would eat with whom, who would receive seats of honor at meals, and how resources would be distributed. Because meals were highly bounded, in other words, people only ate with people like themselves, shared meals in the church became an important site for working through these issues. Despite the challenges, these practices of welcome, care, and respect distinguished Christians from the larger society, which found such hospitable behavior and relationships both challenging and disturbing. But Christian hospitality became a central witness to the truth of the gospel in the first centuries of the church. It marked the gospel as authentic, that Christians from different ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds loved and cared for one another, that they ate together, shared one another's homes and lives, and welcomed strangers. This transformation, those early Christians argued, was proof of the truth of the gospel. They were persuaded that their practices proved that Jesus had come and changed their lives radically. And the hostile outside world noticed. Hospitality, of course, was never only a Christian practice, though in the Christian tradition it did have a distinctive character. In the ancient world, hospitality was viewed as a pillar of morality on which the universe rested. But only Christianity linked hospitality so closely to the divine as Jesus does in Matthew 25, 31 through 46. And that's the very familiar story that Jesus tells about the final judgment and the separation of the sheep and the goats, which is tied to whether or not Jesus was welcomed and fed and clothed. The story where he says to the very surprised sheep and goats, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me," or "I was a stranger and you didn't welcome me. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, brothers and sisters of mine, you've done it to me," or not done it to me. Based on that passage, and the passage in Luke 14, verses 12 through 14, where Jesus says, when you give a party, don't invite your friends and your family and your rich neighbors who can repay you, but instead invite the poor and the broken, the despised. Based on those two passages, the ancient church was convinced that Christians had to open their doors to poor people and to strangers because it might be Jesus who was knocking. It was a very important tradition, tied also to Hebrews 13:2, the instruction to be careful not to neglect hospitality to strangers, because in welcoming strangers you might be entertaining angels without knowing it. So followers of Jesus are invited into a way of life that is distinctive. It's distinctive because of the expectations that welcome to one another, to strangers, even to enemies, will reflect and reenact God's welcome in Christ. And so Paul in Romans 15:7 reminds the community to welcome one another as Christ has welcomed them. Nowhere does Scripture suggest this life of hospitality is safe or easy, but neither does it suggest that it's optional or a gift only for a few. It is central to the life of faithful discipleship, and it is filled with grace. So Christian hospitality partakes of God's grace and reflects God's graciousness. Writers from the 4th and 5th centuries, especially John Chrysostom, Jerome, Lactantius, and others, working with the biblical texts, argued that Christian hospitality should be generous and uncalculating, not offered to get something in return. Instead, it was specifically to be offered to those who didn't seem to have much ability to repay. This was clearly in contrast to contemporary understandings of hospitality that offered it to, quote, worthy recipients. And worthy recipients were those who were able to repay, to give something in return. So hospitality always included family and friends and worthy strangers, but for Christians it was meant to go further, to extend the kind of love and care and welcome to needy strangers, the least of these, the ones who couldn't repay us. So the concern was to make a special effort at welcoming the poor, the sick, and disabled, people that the world usually overlooks. This, I would say, is the distinctive of Christian hospitality, that hospitality is offered to those usually overlooked, and that it is not offered to gain advantage. In other words, it's not used instrumentally as a means to another end. For a number of historical and sociological reasons, the importance of hospitality to the Christian community was eclipsed for centuries. After the first 5 or 6 centuries, it really kind of disappears in the tradition for a long time, with occasional resurfacing. When it was recovered, it rarely had the richness of practice that we see in the ancient church writers. Nevertheless, occasionally, rich and substantive understandings of hospitality reemerge. Jean Vanier, some of you may be familiar with him, the founder of the L'Arche communities that have ministered alongside people with serious disabilities for the last 50 years, writes that hospitality or welcome, quote, is one of the signs that a community is alive. To invite others to be with us, he says, is a sign that we aren't afraid, that we have a treasure of truth and of peace to share. A community that offers hospitality to strangers, he says, is a sign of contradiction, a sign of hope that love is possible in a fractured and hostile world. His understanding of hospitality is deeply connected to the insights of the ancient church writers. So, to conclude this brief overview of the Christian tradition of hospitality, in its best moments, the Christian practice of hospitality challenges us to offer help and welcome with the deepest respect and attentiveness. The wisdom of the biblical tradition strongly challenges us to work to connect vulnerable people with a community where they can be supported and share their gifts. Everyone needs a place where they and their gifts are valued. What characterizes the most vulnerable people, whether refugees or homeless people or children from broken homes or people with disabilities even, is that the regular networks of support have usually failed. And more than anything, they need to be reconnected to community. The tradition also teaches us that hospitality is a remarkable mixture of very ordinary acts of caring and the promise of God's presence within them. Hospitality is full of surprise and mystery. When I interviewed practitioners of hospitality, people who offered hospitality day in and day out, especially to very needy people, the most frequently recurring refrain that I heard from them was, I went into this ministry thinking I was helping them. But you know, I've gotten so much more than I've given. I got so much more than I gave. And I think that's the mystery of the economy of God's grace. And finally, hospitality helps us to think differently about the nature of the Christian life itself. It helps us see that our discipleship is not first about a series of tasks, but rather about a relationship with a living God, a relationship that's full of wonder and mystery because it's lived in response to God's welcome to us. God's welcome then shapes how we engage one another, our neighbors, and the strangers we encounter. It's clear from the scriptures and Christian tradition that hospitality is a demanding practice, but also that it is overflowing with grace and blessing. So let me shift now and map out some of the insights from the last several decades, how the discussions and contexts for hospitality have both changed and remained the same, and why the topic seems at least as important, if not more important today, than it seemed a full generation ago. And first, I would say people's fears about risk and danger in response to strangers never disappear, but neither does the need to respond. Today, the unsettled world situation, fears of terrorism, concerns about being overwhelmed by the needs of refugees and asylum seekers bring to the surface these fears, but also remind us of the utter vulnerability of some strangers. The level of fear and anxiety about strangers seems higher today. In many cases, the rhetoric of fear has given way to overt hostility to strangers. And yet it remains the case that in the practice of hospitality, many of our fears are shown to be terribly exaggerated or entirely unfounded. Second, we continue to face the challenge of figuring out what to do with major social, cultural, ethnic, and religious differences in a pluralistic society. We continue to struggle with questions about how to affirm particularity or particular identity, and yet simultaneously affirm some aspects of common identity and experience that allow us to live and work together. The practice of hospitality remains an important context for working through differences and moving toward understanding and reconciliation. Third, our concerns about the loss of community, the loss of place, and people's longing to belong have continued, and I think they've increased. But with the extraordinary explosion of social media, with its complex implications for community and hospitality, issues of community are even more acute today. And fourth, in our very pragmatic, results-oriented societies, we struggle with using hospitality instrumentally. As much in the church as in schools and businesses, the temptation to use hospitality for some form of gain, to use it to accomplish some other purpose, remains very powerful. And I think this is a major issue, and I want to address it a little bit more in a little bit more detail. Our acts of hospitality do not necessarily diminish our temptations to power, greed, or ambition. Hospitality may allow those temptations to be expressed more subtly, but hospitality can be a useful avenue to these things. That's what corrupted it in the Middle Ages and why it so often degenerates into ambitious entertaining. It's exactly what the ancient church writers warned against. Because hospitality is effective in forging and reinforcing social relationships, and because it's such a profound aspect of human connection, it is a powerful vehicle for accomplishing one's purposes. And so it can be distorted by temptations, especially by some version of ambition. Every historic period has had its temptations to seek advantage in offering hospitality. Ours is no different. We have our own versions of ambitious hospitality. That's actually the language that Lactantius used in the 4th and 5th century, ambitious hospitality. The entertaining that we see in the business world. Think about the carefully planned dinner parties calculated to impress selected important guests. Or even, and here I'm moving to meddling, but even the approaches Christian institutions sometimes use to catch potential large donors. In the church and in Christian organizations and institutions, the instrumental orientation sometimes gets reframed as a question of stewardship. And so we ask, well, what will hospitality accomplish? Is it effective? What are the results? And I would say hospitality is rich with blessing, but such benefits come as gifts, and we should be wary of efforts to turn hospitality into what John Calvin warned was simply a form of commercial exchange, when you do it to get something in return. Today, when Christian organizations engage hospitality substantially, there is a tendency to turn it into a strategy, a means to another end. So hospitality quickly becomes the latest evangelism approach, or the promising new strategy for church growth, or student recruitment, or student retention. Don't get me wrong here. Actually, hospitality can be very effective. But if it's only a strategy, it's also very short-lived. Often the community, while embracing some possible results and even elements of the practice, doesn't recognize the importance of consistency over time, doesn't recognize the reality of the costs or the complexity of hospitality, as it intersects with other practices and values. Sometimes a deep cynicism results if a community doesn't recognize the difference between hospitality as a way of life and hospitality as a strategy. When we use our occasional hospitality as a tool, we distort it, and the people we welcome quickly recognize that they're being used. And the cynicism about the school or the teacher or the church's interest in them becomes palpable as they feel as if they're victims of yet another marketing strategy or project. And yet it's hard to resist the tendency to allow Christian hospitality to be reshaped by the powerful blend of pseudo-intimacy, commercialization, and instrumental thinking that's so characteristic of our time. So the challenge here is to think about hospitality as a way of life, not as a means to an end, not primarily a task to be accomplished. So, back to the changes in hospitality. So I think this is number 5. 30 years ago, hospitality was generally understood as entertaining. And in order for it to be recognized as a robust, life-giving, life-changing practice, there needed to be substantial retrieval work and correctives. Now the term has been recovered by a number of groups and is used as a rallying cry for inclusion and recognition. And it is often used as a synonym for a fairly thin understanding of tolerance, which does not necessarily bear much resemblance to the Christian tradition's understanding of hospitality. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about tolerance and hospitality, because clarification here, I think, is really important. And looking at the intersections and tensions between these two concepts, I think could be useful. But inclusion and tolerance are important values to many people in contemporary society, though I would say that the rhetoric is complexly and unpredictably related to actual practice. And many of those same people worry that fidelity to a particular tradition necessarily implies disrespect for other points of view. Luke Bretherton, in his essay entitled Tolerance, Education, and Hospitality, writes that a good deal of contemporary ethics and public policy is committed to the notion that tolerance is, quote, the way in which incommensurable moral disagreements and cultural differences are to be handled. But tolerance is not necessarily the best way to foster respect for those different from us, or ideas which are different from our own. As Bretherton argues, religiously committed, tradition-specific ways of framing respectful relations allows for both the affirmation of one's own particular tradition or identity and the otherness of the other, while still fostering respect for traditions different from one's own, and an attention to how different traditions overlap. So Bretherton's point is that faith schools or Christian schools do not of necessity inculcate intolerance and hostility to the other. Indeed, contrary to contemporary expectations, he said, it could be that the reverse is true, that religious schools, Christian, Muslim, or otherwise, may well have tradition-specific resources available to them that are better able to foster real respect for the other, the kind of respect that the current promotion of tolerance by liberal philosophies of education seems to undermine. I don't have time to go into the tradition-specific bases for respect, but there are really good examples in John Calvin and John Wesley, who made very strong arguments about respect and care for the stranger, the person who was very different from oneself. On the other hand, Christians do worry, sometimes at least, that a generous practice of hospitality or a posture of welcome might undermine our community's identity or cohesion, that respectful or appreciative interaction with other viewpoints might corrupt our own practices or commitments or threaten unity or identity. Hospitality depends on strong communities of commitment, and yet it pushes them outward. Christian hospitality requires that we cross boundaries and acknowledge and affirm distinctives. This is quite a different understanding from current assumptions held by some in our society who equate hospitality with having no boundaries or with accepting and affirming or even celebrating every belief and behavior. Communities with a strong sense of identity and life-shaping commitments are often very good at offering hospitality, and they are the communities people generally want to join. But as we welcome people into our community for more than a brief visit, issues of shared commitments and lifestyles do become significant, whether it's for a church or a school or a household or even a nation. So practices of fidelity and hospitality are complexly intertwined, and God's hospitality is inseparable from covenantal understandings of fidelity and truth. So there will be tensions in our practice of hospitality because the God of Scripture calls us to hospitality and also to faithfulness to a particular way of life. We've made promises to be true to God's ways, which include both welcoming strangers and living holy lives. This tension is present from the beginning in the Old Testament concerns about covenant, loyalty to God who demands exclusive worship, and who asks that the people of God make a place for the stranger, the vulnerable one, the outsider. And in fact, these tensions run all the way through the tradition. And I think we don't solve the problem by closing the door on strangers or by sacrificing our deepest commitments. So discernment becomes important as we struggle to determine which parts of our identity and commitments are central, fundamental to who we are, and which ones can or should be challenged by the people we welcome. But learning to speak truthfully about this is who we are, or these are the minimal commitments that you need to embrace to be part of the community, is not always easy. But I think as Christians, we need to be careful not to trade our capacity to make distinctions between good and evil for a notion of tolerance that is morally weak. At the same time, however, we must make sure that our concerns about fidelity take seriously God's call to love strangers and neighbors and enemies. Most of our questions about inclusion and exclusion do not run so deep as questions of identity. They are often the result of fear, envy, or trying to protect what we have, whether it's power or privilege or resources. Exclusion and inhospitality are also sometimes the fruit of misplaced fidelity, where we define ourselves by those whom we exclude. Communities will struggle with these issues, but a community that does not offer welcome at all is a community that is dying. It has, as Vanier has noted, it has closed in on itself. In its misguided efforts at fidelity, it has been undone by its own fears. So the intersections of the practices of hospitality and fidelity to particular commitments or a way of life seem to secular society to be very problematic. But actually, it can result in respect and valuing that is much more robust than some notions of tolerance. Often the most hospitable communities are those that have a strong sense of a particular identity and set of commitments. So, getting back to my observations about hospitality in the last 30 years, I think these are the last few, but I think it's number 6. Many people who have engaged in the practice of hospitality have celebrated its mysterious dimension, discovering God's presence in surprising places, the possibility of welcoming Jesus in the guise of a stranger, the importance of mutuality and mutual blessing in guest-host roles or relations. At the same time, practitioners of hospitality today are much more attentive to and critical of some of the power dynamics in guest-host relationships. There's a fairly sophisticated analysis of that at this point, which is important. So there's more recognition and appreciation for the divine mystery in hospitality and for the possibilities of its misuse. And then 7th, there's been, as you all know, a lot of work and interest in the recovery of Christian practices more generally, whether it's Sabbath or gratitude or forgiveness or a number of other practices, and in the wisdom of the ancient church. This has been very good for a more substantive reflection on hospitality and for an increasing understanding of the ways in which we are formed by our practices. So, although there's a lot more I could say about this, let me just summarize this section in this way. First, hospitality is surprisingly important and complicated for how we think about being faithful disciples of Jesus in the world in 2017. And second, we have rich resources in the scriptures and in the Christian tradition for recovering a significant practice of hospitality for our time. But some of the realities of our day make it very challenging. And then also, hospitality is not, as I've been saying, is not always talked about or practiced today in a way that's entirely congruent with how it was understood in the scriptures or in the early church. Not only are Christians using the language more frequently, but many others are also. This makes it especially important to clarify some of our views and distinctives. And so now I want to turn and spend the last part of my presentation offering some reflections, tentative reflections, on teaching and learning in relation to hospitality. While many people would acknowledge that teachers and teaching should be hospitable, what does that mean? What does that mean for learners and learning? Why has the concept and practice of hospitality resonated strongly in education, at least in some circles? And let me offer a couple of very abbreviated responses to that question. I think an emphasis on hospitality is a response to the recognition of the importance of shaping a community of learning that includes students, teacher, and the classroom environment. Also, I think a hospitality paradigm is an alternative to consumer and contract models of education that tend to reduce teaching to dissemination of necessary or marketable skills or knowledge, views students as consumers and teachers as service providers. Hospitality is also a conceptually and practically rich way for dealing with major questions around difference and voice. It's a ready fit with many of the feminist and liberationist concerns about education, especially in terms of power and voice and recognition. So in this section, I'm going to address the question at 4 levels. I'm going to be looking at the practice of hospitality within the practice of teaching, first by looking at the teacher, then at the students, then at the classroom, and then finally at the institution or organization within which they're located. And so first, a few comments on teachers. If we are teachers, we are doing more than communicating content in our courses. We are shaping and forming students to a particular way of life. And if we are forming them, we need to be careful we know the telos, the endpoint toward which we are shaping them. The formation that happens in our classrooms will be a reflection of our values and commitments. A lot of formation comes from how we teach, how we engage students, as much as what we teach them. I am very conscious that how I handle material and students in the classroom, especially difficult students, is a model for my students going into ministry. Even office hours, meals together, conversations on the edges of class are a significant part of the pedagogical and formation process. This means that we also need to be attentive to the shaping of our own character. If we are not intentional in this area, we will unwittingly embody the prevailing values of the larger society. Like our students, we are formed by our practices. I can't create a hospitable classroom if I am not in the habit of being hospitable. Nor can I shape a trustworthy environment if I am not trustworthy. In fact, trying to do that without being formed myself is a recipe for disaster. Students detect dishonesty and hypocrisy quickly, and though they are often forgiving if teachers are honest about our weaknesses, dishonesty on the part of the teacher undermines our strongest claims and our most proficient techniques. Hospitality within teaching is a reminder of the importance of respecting our students. The project of education and formation is characterized by a deep mutuality. A combination of hospitality or welcome and paying close attention to students and their insights is remarkably important because it means that we find them and their ideas genuinely interesting and worth attending to. In the practice of hospitality, the best hosts, the most thoughtful hosts, are often those who have been strangers themselves, who know and cultivate the experience of being an alien, a sojourner. And my guess is that the best teachers remember what it was like to be a student. The fears, the uncertainty, the excitement of discovery, the tentative voice, and that those teachers also see themselves as perpetual, ongoing learners. Cultivating environments in which we continue to be learners and essentially continue to be strangers can be very formative. Over the years, I've learned that many opportunities for hospitality come in the form of interruptions. An orientation toward offering hospitality sometimes collides with our cultural emphases on efficiency and challenges us to reflect on our strong emphasis on technique and measurable results. The most precious resource we have to share is our time, and it is a wonderful gift to give. One of Jean Vanier's comments have challenged me for decades as I respond to interruptions in my busy schedule. He wrote, "Sometimes when people knock on my door, I ask them in and we talk, but I make it clear to them in 1,000 small ways that I am busy and that I have other things to do." He observes, "The door of my office is open, but the door of my heart is closed." I think it can be helpful as an educator also to reflect on the various visions or metaphors of teaching that capture us and guide us. Certain practices are associated with each metaphor, and I'm grateful here to the work done in a prior Kuyers Institute conference that looked at teaching and Christian imagination, exploring the metaphors for teaching as pilgrimage, or teaching and learning as pilgrimage, gardening and building. For me, I think it has been preparing a table, setting the table for students, hosting a meal that's been a powerful metaphor for teaching for me, and has allowed hospitality to fit well as a practice within my teaching. Just a few words about hospitality and students. Every student brings gifts to class. As Henry Nouwen has noted, a person will not know what her or his gifts are if there's no one to receive them. The challenge is to find the gifts the student brings and create an environment in which the teacher and fellow classmates receive the person and his or her gifts with gratitude, especially when the gifts are quite tentative or odd or wrapped badly. Ellen Marmon, who's one of my colleagues, wrote on hospitality and education that at the start of her courses, she asks students what they plan to give to the course. And I think that's a very interesting shift in orientation. Students certainly can bring challenges as well as gifts, and our commitment to hospitality can be sorely tested by a student's persistent sense of entitlement or postures of boredom, distraction, or disrespect. Another challenge that I found with students and hospitality is to help students practice hospitality toward one another in the classroom. In my own experience, not all students are eager to learn from each other, especially in environments heavily oriented to individual achievement. Students sometimes see classmates as competitors or view serious engagement with them or their insights as a total waste of time. For some students shaped by expectations that education is exclusively about gaining content from a teacher, there is an attitude that if the teacher isn't lecturing, they aren't learning. And so I've come to recognize that part of my role as teacher is in reinforcing the insights offered by students and explicitly valuing their contributions and kind of moving them forward in the discussion. So just a few words about the classroom. In the classroom, hospitality is among the most crucial practices for building a learning community. Parker Palmer has written, a learning space has three major characteristics, three essential dimensions: openness, boundaries, and an air of hospitality. In teaching, hospitality is not so much another task to add to the syllabus as it is a different way of thinking about the class, the process, the teachers and students, as well as the discipline. It doesn't necessarily mean trying to fit more into a course. It's more about doing it in a different way and cultivating certain virtues and practices, such as curiosity, attentiveness, taking time, and expectation of mutuality. Said differently, it's really about creating space for one another. The most hospitable classrooms are not necessarily those that are the most freewheeling or open. There is a tendency in hospitality, or there is a tension in hospitality. Structures and rules have a role in making a place safe, especially for those who are strangers to the institutional culture of the host community. Just like homeless people can get in trouble because they don't know the rules of a shelter and they violate them without knowing it, students don't always know the etiquette and expectations of the classroom unless those expectations are articulated clearly. In classes that encourage a lot of discussion, teacher and class are certainly vulnerable to disruptive students who don't know or perhaps don't care how to be good participants in a learning community. They are a bit like troublesome guests, reminding me that teaching, like hospitality, requires some cooperation between hosts and guests. Teaching with a lot of discussion and input from students requires a lot more monitoring by the professor, but also significant self-monitoring by students than does a straight lecture, or even lecture with questions and answers at the end. At the same time, I found that it's surprisingly easy to silence some students if I have a difficult student and challenge him or her, or lose patience in front of the class, which never happens, of course. I can find that I have discouraged other more hesitant students from speaking or from challenging me. And yet, if I don't confront the disruptive student, they can dominate the class in unhelpful ways. Hospitality is sometimes viewed as kind of a soft, squishy practice, or a feminine concern that's nice if you've got the time. Such attitudes match responses I received when I first started my dissertation. People who were genuinely puzzled by the topic and asked, "You're doing a PhD dissertation on coffee and donuts?" Creating a hospitable classroom and a hospitable posture in teaching can make it harder to maintain a sense of authority in the classroom. It is easily misunderstood by students and fellow faculty members as soft. I remember the challenges I faced, particularly when I was starting out, to maintain authority with students who were not used to a more hospitable style of teaching. We can get past these issues, but it requires knowing that there is a robust biblical and theological basis for practicing hospitality and a strong pedagogical basis for bringing it into the classroom. There are certainly dangers in an exclusive emphasis on hospitality in the classroom, that tolerance or affirmation destroys attentiveness to truthfulness and fidelity, or academic rigor. Hospitality, gratitude, and fidelity make a classroom safe enough for truthfulness. But basically, we don't want to sacrifice one important practice for another. We need to find ways to hold them together and in tension. Similarly, efforts at building community in class can become coercive and dishonest. And so it's important to recognize that respect, fidelity, and truthfulness are other practices that intersect with and shape and are shaped by hospitality. Shared food and conversation are two of the central features of hospitality around the world, food and talking. I have found that they are also an important part of the classroom. Where I can, and always when I'm teaching intensive courses that span entire days, eating together is a central part of the course, whether it's potluck or I supply the meal or eating together in the dining hall. It changes the dynamics of the classroom significantly. There's more trust, there's more depth of sharing, there's more eagerness to be together. And I think it's significant that Jesus did a lot of formation work around meals. A lot of his teaching was in the context of meals. Hospitality toward texts and traditions means seeking first to listen and understand and then to critique. There is a way in which we can treat the materials we study as honored guests, or allow authors, in a sense, to host both teacher and students. Also, hospitality toward authors and texts from the past means that we won't lay on them anachronistic expectations, even as we do offer truthful appraisals of the problematic nature of some texts and theories. And at least in my setting, I found that it can be helpful to see the classroom as bigger than myself as the teacher and my students, bigger even than us and the fellowship of texts or the discipline and the authors. Students, I found, are often processing material from other classes, insights from other faculty members as they process material and experience in my class. So I think that hospitality here invites a more multidisciplinary appreciation for the connections and intersections across the curriculum. And finally, just a word at education and hospitality and sort of the larger institution. How we live together, serve together, and work together in Christian institutions or organizations or schools is a very powerful message to our students. Cultivating a good institutional life and an environment is part of the curriculum. Hospitality in teaching is not just about our interactions with our students in our classroom. It is about how faculty members treat one another. Pressures of assessment in education or teaching to measurable results make a commitment to hospitality harder institutionally because it's not as easy to measure. But on the other hand, hospitality can't ever be a cover for classes that are poorly prepared or devoid of content or academic rigor. Practices of a healthy community or educational institution, of course, involve more than hospitality. Again, they involve fidelity and gratitude, truthfulness, Sabbath, discernment, forgiveness, and so on. We're most likely to notice the failures in these practices: betrayal, overwork, deception, complaining. But it's the practices that form the institution and the faculty and the students. So to conclude, and to allow time for, I hope, for comments and questions, let me reiterate, hospitality is not a means to an end in teaching. It's a crucial element of the vision and reality we desire in a community of faithful learners. If we see hospitality as the next skill set or framework to make our classes work better, we will have missed the point. When we offer welcome and practice hospitality, we are living into the practices of God. Hospitality is a way of life, a way of being, deeply connected to the gospel. It's rich with grace and mystery. It feeds us as well as our students because it's so closely tied to God's grace and offered in grateful response to God's welcome to us. Thank you. I think we have time, a good amount of time actually, for comments or questions. Can we have a little bit more light in here? Is that possible? And I think I don't know how to do this. Technology is not one of my strengths. Or maybe he has to do it. Anyway, we'll start this way. Is this on? Oh, it is. Okay, good. Are there comments or questions or observations Actually, I think sometimes just flat-out straightforwardness with certain students can be quite helpful, so truth-telling in a way. I think something of a sense of humor has rescued me in a number of those settings where if you can kind of respond with humor, but also kind of, what did one of my friends talk about, sort of policing the borders. I mean, I think over the years, now it's been a long time, and I really did struggle with this when I first came, and I think part of it was gender-tied. My students were not used to having a woman professor, for the most part, and then one who wanted to sort of operate in a more mutual environment. It was a recipe for difficulty. I think I mean, some of it just comes with growing older, but some of it I think comes with kind of an anticipatory practice where you recognize where things are going to be difficult. Occasionally, I have taken students aside and talked to them about their role in the class. I do more up front when we first start with the class and say, this is going to work only if you make it work with me. So I think more of the straightforward talk about fidelity and truthfulness right at the beginning has helped sort of knowing where the landmines are going to be. Yeah. But there's always that one student, right, that undoes you. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of that one student, so when we place, I'm sorry, I'm Curtis Cunningham from John Brown University, and when we place hospitality in the context of our home, we invite people in because we want to spend time with them. But sometimes in the context of our classroom, we have students that, for personalities or whatever, we don't necessarily want to spend time with them. Do you have practical strategies for, I don't know, willing yourself or extending hospitality to maybe some difficult or cantankerous students?
It's a challenge, isn't it? I mean, it can make a class very difficult, and it's particular, I mean, if they're cantankerous, it's one thing. If they actually derail the class, it's very discouraging. I think I've done a couple things that have been helpful, at least to me. One is to pray for them, and pray for myself. Sometimes meeting with them individually and sort of figuring out what's going on can be helpful. Sometimes for me, it's been sort of enduring. You know, and thinking one way or another, the student's going to pass because I never want him or her in my class again. But I think it can be challenging. I don't know if I have any great strategies. I do think that prayer has changed my attitude toward them. I think sometimes I have a higher threshold for annoyance than the person's classmates do, and that makes me very worried about that student because they're succeeding in alienating 30 other of their classmates. That's no service to them either, to allow that to go on. So it's a challenge, but that's where you really do struggle, I think, with hospitality and sort of truthfulness and figuring out how to be honest without, you know, without doing it in anger or frustration. Yeah.
Again, thank you. Amanda Pittman, Adelaide Christian University. I wonder if you could talk about hospitality and teaching, specifically with regard to assessment. No. Right, so
Why don't you talk about hospitality and assessment? Yeah. No, tell me.
hospitable classroom practices don't remove the power dynamic inherent in the fact that I assign the students grades
Oh, okay.
at the end of a semester, right?
Right.
So I've had students who have found my classroom very welcoming right up until I graded for anything, and they didn't receive the A they expected.
And they're very,
I'm curious if there are things you do as you're grading, or ways you approach or frame the feedback you give students that are connected to the way you view hospitality is operated in the classroom.
I think that's a really, I thought you were talking about more of the assessment that goes with accreditation, and I was like, no, 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 no. But regular classroom assessment, that is a challenge, isn't it? Because students, if you take a posture of hospitality, they do think you're soft, and they're annoyed if they don't get the grade they wanted. I think there are a couple of things. I do try to find, at least in essays and those kind of things, ways to affirm something and then to note the difficulties. And I certainly tell them where I think there's a problem. And I try to be available to talk them through. Usually it's okay. I mean, I think they experience it a little bit as a betrayal because they thought they knew you and they thought they could trust you, and then you failed them. And so I think taking that seriously and recognizing that their work is sometimes the best they have to offer, and then trying to figure out how to value it and simultaneously help them move toward a better peace, I think is significant. Yeah, I don't know that that's anything particularly exceptional. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Kevin Taylor, Front Range Christian School, Littleton, Colorado. Just to add a little piece to that, while the same thing with grading, in some ways are assessing as ongoing conversation. Right? So you're inviting students into the more that's to come with you. But I have a question for you. It's interesting when you talk about the power relations of guest and host. And that got me thinking, you said that oftentimes the best teachers can be those who have seen themselves as strangers in the past, but then also continuing on to maybe even engage in practices that keep them every once in a while in that stranger role. Right? What sort of practices have either you seen as effective for you in doing that, or other teachers to where it's made a difference in their classrooms?
I actually, it brings to mind my colleague with whom I teach ethics, who is currently involved in a historical architecture course at the University of Kentucky as a student, and the insights he has gained after having been a teacher at Asbury for like 25 years or 23 years, going back into the classroom as a student has been really interesting. I think it actually has changed his teaching somewhat. So that's just a very basic one. I think, especially for my colleagues and for me, one of the most fundamentally shaping experiences as sort of a learner teacher at the same time is teaching in international contexts where you really are completely dependent on the host environment to help you figure out how to sort of position yourself there, where you're continually learning along with your students and so on. So that's been a really helpful experience. I think for me, oftentimes, I find myself a learner in some of the settings outside of the regular seminary classroom, where when I go and speak and I'm working with people who work with homeless people or with refugees or whatever, I am very much in the role of learner at the same time as I'm sharing something with them. Yeah, it's interesting, yeah. No. No. Well, I think that the struggle is that we measure what we can measure, right? And so to try to make hospitality measurable, I think at times makes it somewhat trivial. So you count off, things that you can count off, but it's kind of missing the main point. I don't have a problem with assessment. I know that's necessary. I do have a problem when some of the most important things that we do in terms of formation get pushed a little bit to the side because they don't meet assessment standards or whatever that can be measured. That's all I was saying. Yeah.
With your class and maybe policing discussion, so to speak. What are some other concrete practices that you might have in your pedagogy or classroom that you find help to build hospitality? So I'm thinking of like icebreakers or group work or what kinds of things?
Yeah. I don't do a lot of those. I mean, I do some small group work. Again, it's graduate students, so it's a slightly different dynamic. I would say there's a couple of things. I almost never do what I did tonight, which is straight lecture, so that I invite students to interact with me along the way. I think that changes the nature of the classroom. I mean, I definitely have content I need to communicate. They need to come out of that class knowing basic Christian ethics. But there are different ways of doing that. And so I really try, most of the time I limit my classes to 30 students. I can do that. So that there can be a lot of discussion, a lot of engagement. In something like ethics, students know a lot more than they think they know, although they don't necessarily have the vocabulary. So inviting them to engage the material from out of their experience and so on turns out to be pretty good. I mean, I'm not suggesting that always is extremely effective, but that is how I teach. So I like dialogue, and I'm happiest when they are actually interacting with each other in a classroom discussion. I feel like something has succeeded if they, in fact, engage each other's ideas rather than it just be me and the student and myself. I'm trying to think what... I'll come back. If I think of something else, I'll come back to that. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Let's say there's a whole Baptist University. Can you speak some to the relationship of hospitality and humility?
Yeah, I mean, I think that humility is incredibly important in the guest-host dynamic, and that there's not going to be mutuality between the guest and host if there isn't humility in the host. I mean, I think it's sort of expected oftentimes in the guest, especially if they're coming in need. But on the part of the host, a recognition, and one of the things that I talk about a lot in hospitality is that the host really needs to recognize that the guest, even the neediest guest, is also bringing gifts, that there's something that because of the dynamic of God's grace, there's something that's going on more than just sort of meeting a need. And that depends on a host being willing to see that they also have needs. They don't just have the resources. And I think that would follow also in terms of a teacher-learner, teacher-student kind of dynamic. Yeah. Yeah.
Indiana Wesleyan. Really like you mentioned having authors as honored guests. I'd like you don't mind expounding on how you welcome authors.
I remember when I was doing my dissertation, and I was spending the most ridiculous amounts of time with John Chrysostom, John Calvin, and John Wesley. I felt like they were my friends, I mean, it was ridiculous. I was spending way more time with them than I was with any living person. And I felt like, I really liked them. And I felt like there was a conversation. I did at times feel like they were hosting me. It was very interesting to me, that dynamic. And I really felt when I introduced them to my students that I wanted them to sense, in a way, both that the authors were hosting us, so that we were kind of a collection of learners looking at the text. And I think that works also in biblical studies, that the text is the shared thing. But also in a sense that, there's an incredible privilege in introducing people to that material and treating them like they are honored guests, and that you want to get to know them, and you want to get to know them sort of on their terms, not just imposing your critique right away. So I think a respectful engagement with the text has turned out to be really satisfying to me. Yeah. Anything else?
Most of our talk about hospitality is taking
I think it's somewhat oppressive to insist on being host all the time. I mean, that is a power move. And an unwillingness to receive is really problematic. I think one of the ways that we show respect is by allowing someone to host us. I can remember actually when I was working with refugees, and some of you have traveled in countries where people are very poor, how difficult it is sometimes to receive their hospitality because we feel like we're taking what little they have, but how important it is and as an expression of respect and love to receive it. I think it's similar with religious others and so on. The way we show respect is a willingness to hear from them, to recognize that they do have something to offer, that we're willing to listen long enough to understand, and then possibly move to a different level of conversation. But I think it can be really problematic if we only see ourselves as having something to offer, and not that we continually have something to learn. Yeah. Don't know if that was, is that what you were asking? Yeah. Anybody else? Everybody has meals together. There are a lot more meals, a lot more shared meals. I think, I mean, I'm trying to think of the 5 people that we've welcomed this year, but I think in the past, the conversations about hospitality have been, they've become part of the community conversation. I mean, I think that some of my comments about being careful that it's not instrumental also comes from kind of a worrisome, eagerness to use it because it works. Not so much on the part of my colleagues, but sometimes for admissions and enrollment and those kind of things. But I think with my colleagues, it is, maybe it gives a little bit more freedom for them to experiment in their classes with more discussion or more engagement or more unusual ways of doing things, but they're pretty good on their own with that. But I think it has allowed an institutional conversation for, hopefully for better. Yeah. Anybody else? I think we might have worn everybody out. Good. Thank you.